and then we'll begin. But did you get some food, Matvei? Yeah?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't see all my students. Maybe they're in the back. Introducing our guest and reading his bio to everyone. I'm not a good host. I'm I'm very spontaneous. So I formal events don't fit my character very well. But let's try this. Okay. So Matvei Yankelevich is a poet, translator, and editor. His books include the poetry collections Some Worlds for Dr. Vogt, right? And Dead Winter, as well as the translations Today I Wrote Nothing, the selected writing of Daniil Kharms, right? And Alexander Vvedensky's An Invitation for Me to Think. He is the winner of the 2014 National Translation Award. He has received fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities, among others. In the 1990s, he co-founded Ugly Duckling Presse, where he edited and designed books, periodicals, and ephemera for more than 20 years. As of 2022, he is the editor of World Poetry Books, a nonprofit publisher for poetry and translation. He teaches translation and book arts at Columbia University's School of the Arts. Just recently, Matvei launched his new press project, Winter Editions. And you should check this out because one of my books is coming with Winter Editions.
Wintereditions.net.
Wintereditions.net. There are actually 9 books coming out, including 4 in May, some during the summer, and then some in the fall. So check that out. I actually saw some of the copies of the new books, and they're beautiful. They really are. They're being printed in Lithuania, right? Yeah. All right. So what did they say? Without further ado, right? You have a poem about what did they say? So they say without further ado. Matvei Yankelevich.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. Nice to see some familiar faces, but also many new people. How do we want to, do we start with a reading or do we start with a...
I would like to treat this as a reading since Matvei was a guest for my other class and we exhausted him with questions. So now we want to give you the podium so you can read your own poems. And yeah, feel free to share with us from any of your books and including some new poems if if you wish.
Okay. So I guess mostly I'll read almost entirely from a long project of poems called, tentatively titled From a Winter Notebook, part of which is this long series of poems I've been writing for some time now, and part of those, a selection of those poems have come out in Dead Winter and also in this little chapbook From a Winter Notebook. Yeah, I think I'll read those things. Although maybe I'll start before that with a poem for spring. I think this was partly written here, visiting your city in blossom. And this is from an earlier book, Some Worlds for Dr. Vogt, which has a lot of different worlds imagined in it. It also, this particular one quotes from or steals from the Ukrainian-born Russian-language poet Arkady Dragomoshenko. Pose a world as a tautology, or an equilibrium, a state of balance, or static. Something like the river flows, already redundant. What, in fact, is its shape? For instance, someone gave you this beer, so you can't do anything about it. You can drink it as long as you stand relatively still, describing to yourself the view or the way the tree trunks lay in the northern woods, leafless then, save for the ground cover, so that vision is not a noun, but the unachievable form of the verb reading. Legere. Greeks choose to speak. Romans pick through the ruins. All this is well known, but bears repeating. Cherry blossoms in the rain, the season's emotional efficacy. To chew the crust, another way to bite down. Even the shapes of Eros, you know, are finite. Okay, so I'll turn to the winter notebook stuff. And I guess as far as, I hope there'll be time for questions. What's our time frame? We have an hour here or something?
We have...
Or less?
Yeah, we have more than an hour.
Okay.
Actually.
Well, I won't read to you for more than 2 hours. I'll read some poems. They're all fairly short. You'll notice some things in this series of poems that are quite obvious constraints or forms, in that you'll start to notice very obviously that each one contains the word winter, either in the first line or in the last line. And also something that you may not hear, but perhaps interesting for those of you in Ahmad's class, is that they're built on, or they're edited into or sculpted into syllabic lines. So every poem, and if I choose, in some cases there's an alternation of syllables, but mostly if I choose a 10-syllable line, I stick with that throughout the poem. So it's not meter, but there may be an echo of meter that pushes to the foreground, and we'll see what you think of that.
And some of them are 14 lines, too.
And some of them are 14 lines, which reminds me, I'm going to try to read those. And And some of them have something to do with translation or echoes, translating others into English, sometimes with the sound of translation into English. Sometimes you won't notice anyway. It is winter, a way to begin, formless, not in a narrow notebook, narrow in light. Fat brown bug greets me at the door. Who knows how long it's been, half dead or full dead for that matter. Now from dustpan to flushing gutter, same as unplain cant. Mine this slant speech, saber of our commerce and its sword to ensure profit. I prefer it to pretending nature. Let it ring, the more so as dom 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 is home. Doomed bell, culling us back from battle to same office of winter poems. I'll just mention this. I read this earlier, but you didn't hear it. So this poem, there's a person named Roy in the poem, but that's actually Leroy Jones, Amiri Baraka. So there's a little quotation. It is winter, a gray slate to chance, to desire to be less. The anniversary is coming. Whose ghost will look over my shoulder now as I'm shaving? Roy was right on. Love is evil. 50 years on, who needs it? Freedom, poetry. Though at one time it seemed necessary. Bills and books muck out a desk. Watch me run magic fingers above my chalk cahiers. This one's for me. It's too short. I'll just go into Dead Winter. Maybe I'll read a few from here. Winter comes calling while I'm on vacation. Autoresponder, etc. The book's not done. Mail piled like snow. Of a sudden, life looks brief. Just this mangled foam, this form for which you've spared no part. There might not be a chance to change or quit changing. My blue notebook's sad and modern. So if I write, the self is wispy, sure, but strike that line. They say you can't edit poetry, but I say fuck it. Winter's prison, fog, the titles I write down to read, each night too short to write that letter you would rather I not write. Here, useless struggles worth my while. I cleave persistent loafing, desperate inertia. To sing without a tune, figuratively abstract, the sound product of tying my shoes. Now when I'm pulsed to change a word, I often leave it, not my suspicious friend, for love of it as is, but of serious boredom, so that you too may feel that drag and this hang also. On winter's hungry mornings, bloated belly and weak joints, I tried writing it down, putting it down, and expressing what was inside and getting it out, setting it down and drawing it out of me, adding to it, sculpting from it like a slab, stabbing, chiseling away, hammering blows, making a hole in myself from which it could flow like paint, making an opening and beating the rhythm out of sentences and breaking it down, abandoning it to fester and foam as pus out of the wound, and down onto the page, down being the direction, out onto the page, out being the direction, pushing it, expelling it outward toward the page being the direction, describing it as best I could in the language that calls me, in which I name desires, the desires which are also fears, abstractions, generalizations, insecurities, to form what is unformed, what is chaos, inchoate or embryonic, digital, not biologic, though it does breathe. And how to get to it is to let the coffee go cold. At least they say that is the way. I tried that way. Winter, have I lost your thread? Downridden hole around you? I laugh at my poems, scare my friends, see carefree moments in the distance. At what cost? And if I write this backwards, stay time's goose-step march with this superfluous smoke, one more glass of claret, one fragment of a poem, all too poor copy of wild abandon. Without your thighs to burrow, I smell the passing age, quick era passing over me to where it proudly hurries, cold of heart. This penmanship delights in its own decay, downgraded to a scribble, a palliative effacement, bathos sutured to my hand. This is a slightly more narrative poem for this series. Unseasonably warm winter's Sunday. I read the papers. Sorry, the tense is wrong. Unseasonably warm winter's Sunday. I read the papers, clowned tiny leisure class belonging, frittered morning away in frying eggs, head full of fusty sentences predicting falling futures. How one does what one does is now beyond me. I push against it from this side of iron gates and yell so softly, safely, this was not meant to be. So let blonde children overrun the park. I'll seek the castaway bench in its darkest corner under construction, there to fight life, if life this is, where leaves aren't swept and the homeless men make do and paramedics pass blindly the world made big enough for us. Here I build my bridge to traverse the world with a shark's milky eye. Invisible, I write something as if holding ruddy apples across my chest, cradled against wide stripes of garish sweater. Short of life, a day off. Shapes pass, mostly soft, big people, slow, save the angular dog that jumps to the very end of its master's leash. By sleight of hand or miracle, mist rolls off the disabled fountain. Okay. Here's more bathos. In a sorry. In a disjunctive age, sorry, in a disjunctive age, disconsolate without connection, I lick this postage stamp, a thing that you may not have ever licked. Pulp paper trails the color of cracked walnut shells and corkboards. To write this is to stay up till tomorrow cannot be a day to read about the dead, tear further troubles, to have later seams to mend, put forth exhaustion from which to recover, tame rhetoric in its wide, trembling circus tent. Word for word, I change to pass through night in pace with night, time as if bravely lost, but lost all the same. There's no decision left to make. Choice narrows down the lane. In time, the brooks and soldiers run away from tinny villanelles. Even your name, your status update, divorced, vacating job, collecting dust, disheartened, now deceased, means little, if at all, a thing it is to be. Compared to what? Compared to winter's day? The heat of these laughable plastic keys? Pass by the co-work. They offered gelato, unlimited Australian coffee, non-dairy creamers, sweeteners provided. Check. Nothing. Quiet's playing at the movies. Blue hydrangeas. So I go home past runners training behind glass to run longer in American apparel. I think I hear somebody say to someone, "You look like a Cy Twombly." Then I come back to you in Spain, though it's only your photo I tacked up by the door last winter sometime. This one's refers to Bernadette Mayer, a poet who passed recently. Here the poet wrote all of midwinter day in that brick house, main street of Little Mill Town in the mountains around the corner from the bookstore. Woods smoke in the air, low clouds, low-lying sun caught up in lower branches like its lowered gaze, that bare melancholy of identification. Such long days are no longer long. Can a coal century bear its weight in wars and prose? Umbrish gardens of the twilight of the gods, these hills, these mansions turning downward at the lip. This is my house. I've lived in it, made love, looked out these windows, baked in the kitchen, misshaped love by feeding one lover's cake to another. Had I your hands, I'd give up my ambitions. What matters now that far away you think of nothing but what's close at hand? To win your pity, that it congrue to mercy, is my burden. To speak it burdens others. This posture gets the worst of me. The better to walk your mile in my shoes and get nowhere. Somewhere winds a clock. I hear it grinding, gears, its bells in the empty tower of my chest. Say ancestors, they'll sigh, all right. Drink until insight comes, or sleep. What's liquid must pour out, and vessel empty of what memories a friend to lend a hand, penitent, gloveless, sweeping snow from our last winter's windshield. in the last class, some folks asked me about, earlier this morning, about Russian modernist poets. I translate from Russian, as may have been clear, I don't know, in the bio. And I'm currently working on Osip Mandelstam, kind of the Russian modernist T.S. Eliot kind of figure, but with a very different fate. And completely different, but nonetheless of such stature. And this poem has like a little image from him that it doesn't really matter that it's from him, but it is something that, and from another poet named Boris Pasternak. So this poem kind of pushes together to, in a way that a lot of these poems do without kind of pointing it out too much, some foreign tropes or foreign moments and something that is unlikely to resonate in English, but I'm interested in what it does when it appears in English. Winter, a landscape in questions, old punctuation. The floorboards creaking, I step out to bitter moons. Don't worry, the notebooks are all with the proper authorities. Such little things make life, and buttonholes let it seep out. It can happen in no time, and now it's over. The window cracks the landscape into allegory. The grove of spruce or pine over there, it stands apart. The planner is full, and it's only February. Okay. I don't know, maybe I'll read this. Should I read a couple new ones? What's the time? Let me just make sure. I guess I could read a few more. How do you feel? Or whenever you want to turn to questions, we can. Is it still good to keep going for a bit? Okay. You're getting the hang of this winter thing? It's monotonous. Droning, complaining, and
maybe another spring poem. Do you have another one?
No,
in
spring
you?
poem. Sorry. Yeah.
No. I mean, let's let's put an end to winter.
Okay.
And maybe, but I
could also pause and we can have some dialogue or questions, and then read a few more poems if you want. Or
yeah, sure. I mean, read another winter poem.
Okay.
I feel I cut you off.
okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, there are a few other newer ones that aren't in the book that I'll maybe read if we get to them. I'll read this one. It has also kind of steals a line from the poet Keith Waldrop, who's also a great translator, whose translations of Paul Verlaine. I don't know if anyone heard of Rimbaud. Paul Verlaine tried to shoot Rimbaud because they were in the lovers' spat. Guns, wow! Like then Rimbaud went and was a gun runner, and I mean, why guns? So it's so important, but so prevalent.
That was
anyway,
his career after.
After he stopped writing poetry, what are you going to do? You're going to run guns, So keep writing poetry.
But at that time in history, guns were new. Like there was still kind of a new
more or
toy
less
to play with.
There were lots of revolutions that needed guns. So, but so did Verlaine. Needed a gun to shoot his lover, friend, Rimbaud, but he missed, I think, or he grazed him. So anyway, Keith Waldrop's translations of Verlaine, I've just been working on a book, and it's coming out in May. It's Keith has translated a lot of things, but it's kind of a cool late 19th century poet done in a very Irreverent Style by Keith Waldrop. Anyway, that will come out this May from this press that where I now edit, the World Poetry, which of course, as the name suggests, only does poetry and translation. Anyway, so this has a little line from him, and it's sort of, I don't know, kind of anyway, it's a 3-part poem. So you'll see why. Remember winter chapbooks and long days of chairs being chairs under us as usual, usable, useful as the guilt of, remember I did this for you. Sweeping the floor in anticipation of your midnight visit, I'm doing it for me as much as you, and think how terrible to mention in the future, remember? I'd rather say it's for me and my boring blue notebook, meanest of my small possessions. Surely this smoke will clear my head. Offer my cig to the set sun, ash on the floor I just swept. What survives winter? Under spell of Stein, swept so much under the rug, see the bump rising up, a raised belly. I blew smoke in your face for you, and I wrote about letters and addresses, remember? The strangest people remember my poems, but friends rarely do. Not that I remember all of yours, and glad you didn't do me that favor. Turns out love doesn't read you, doesn't listen when you talk, whatever you talk, doesn't care much for pain as yours is a part of it, like a chair or other already things. I balked at winter as a child, drank deeply of diffident mud. Now more alone, I drink low light and wait. It's almost midnight. For snow to dress up night? Ah, melancholy. It's time to scrap a bit, complain, waste time, forget enigmas, eventually stupid ends and supermen, their proud memento mori. What have I learned from you, poem? With steady hand I move to trash. What hope of whispers when evening is broadcast? Reduced to traces, stray fluids on temporary surfaces. Yet once he could recite the Aeneid backward.
Beautiful.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So maybe I'll pause there. We could do a little talk.
Let's.
And I can read some one or two newer pieces.
So, please. Would you like a microphone, or should we do this microphone kind of?
Oh, for the future.
Hey, everybody likes a microphone.
In case there's a future.
Thanks for your poetry. I've often heard,
You're welcome.
I've often heard poetry translators remark about a phenomenon where a sort of ordinary poetic trope in one language, if it gets translated literally, creates an entirely different effect in the new language, and that it's almost as if there's no poet involved in that creation. You know, it's sort of like something that the languages themselves have created. And I sort of sense that you play with that a little bit in some of the poems you read. Is that, I mean, do you have any comments about that, or?
Yeah, it's preoccupying. It's also, for me, as a bilingual kind of person, or a person who's not exactly at home in the U.S. language, and also not really at home in what people like to call the mother tongue. And I think that is not an unusual state these days, more and more, not unusual. And exophonic writing is actually most great writing, most writing in the world now, especially in terms of English and all kinds of writing, right? Business writing, et cetera, right? Every legal writing, international writing, politics, political writing. So much is happening in English. So English is in a state of flux, of, great, and has always been, quite varied. There's never really been one English. So I'm interested in like moving in that space of different Englishes, but I also like part of that is going back in these poems, because they are winter poems, to think about obsolete diction, poetic styles, Victorian language, inversion, and all kinds of things that aren't part of the contemporary poetic language for like what is considered contemporary poetry, and also to, in a way, reintroduce things that are outdated, outmoded, old-fashioned, and or retrograde, or and also to trouble that kind of historical unity of a contemporary English, and to really think about, well, I guess because I think there's something important in writing poetry about what is an important question about what poetry is now, what does it do, and what is it for, and what is its social function, so I'm very curious about what kind of renovating the contemporary, or the notion of having to be contemporary, especially as I am less and less contemporary as I get older, and more and more becoming part of the past, and thinking about more poets who are no longer with us, and even people who I've known, and just exploring like all of the Englishes and English and poetry traditions, but also the way other poetries have been translated into English, whether it's from Arabic or from Occitan, the troubadours, or Chinese poetry, all just like to see all the manners and all the weird and different ways over the many years that these poetries have come into English, and not to think of that translational language as sort of the translation, but also think of it as historically situated and stylistically situated in its own moments, right? Each translation, a Victorian translation, is going to be different from a deep image 1970s translation with plain spoken English or something, right? So thinking about that is also the history of English poetry to mine. And then I have this sort of interest in the idiom, or the, there's a great essay by, oh, sorry. Okay, I'm going to skip that. Maybe I'll remember in a moment. It's all in here, in my other mind. Anyway, that thinking about how to, idioms are so strange, or like proverbs and things, like they don't make any sense if you translate them literally, in a sense, but they also don't always make sense when you, like, they are about something else. There's something, both we have these concepts in our language, kind of like, I don't know, but there is something that's going to be transmuted, transformed, and I'm interested in not domesticating that idiom, but like letting it sit kind of uncomfortably. So even in the first poem I read, to bite the crust is to chew the crust is another way to bite down, and that has something to do with, I mean, I can't even really say what it is in Russian. It's some phrasal construction that's common that really doesn't work in English. Like, it's not, I make it sound like, oh, it's just another idiom, but kind of not really an idiom in English, right? And similarly, there are pieces in these poems where I take either constructions or like kind of common phrasal units from Russian, which is the other language I know best, and kind of push them into English a little bit without trying to find a easy equivalent for them. I don't know. It's translation pushes right against and changes hopefully the language, the poetic language at least, that we have, and that's part of why it's important, not just because of the content that it brings over, right, but what is it doing in this language. I don't know, does that answer?
Interesting going the other direction from translating some English poem into Russian.
I don't typically, but sometimes my earlier work, this book, Boris by the Sea, began from translating myself into Russian, back into English, and creating this kind of like, like deforming English by like processing it through my other language, and thereby making it a book kind of about the acquisition of language, about immigration. It's this Boris character, about like the world and language more basically, the relationship of language to the things of the world, and how that so somehow going back and forth helped me kind of create the drama of that, and the tension of the language being almost like sometimes like a primer, like you're learning a language, or so it's really super simple, but in that simplicity kind of awkward. So yeah, that's maybe some answers or some responses. Does that work?
No,
I can see you're not satisfied. But we're here for you.
I mean, I was struck that almost all of the poems you read are about writing poetry.
In a sense.
So that's sort of
what poem
what
isn't?
you were into, I take it.
Yes, they are. But about writing poetry now, here, with all of the political intersections that I occupy.
I mean, I maybe would add that it's hard to say that that the languages are doing the work themselves.
I just said that to be provocative.
Yeah.
But I'm glad you got a rise out of you.
Because we're manipulators of language. And language doesn't do anything by itself.
Well, it's constantly constructed,
what about a
right?
machine translation of a poem.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean,
but that is also that machine is made by humankind, right? Yeah. So it has its limitations, as do we.
Absolutely.
I think maybe poetry tries to assign a different role to language than the usual, and that's what's interesting about poetry. But usually the use of language is very manipulative, very dishonest, very cliche.
Yeah, or controlling, or telling you what to do. Don't walk on the lawn. Or I keep passing this one sign that's addressed to dogs, but it's in English, and it says, "Dear dog, please don't poop on my grass," or something. Or it's like, I forget what it is, but and maybe it's the grass speaking, or the little plants speaking to the dog, but they speak English for some reason. I don't. Please don't pee on me.
Yeah, so I think what Matvei is doing is maybe like just inserting like a certain kind of historical perspective into the process of translating.
Somewhat like foreignizing, you could say, like something that's slightly a marker of like this, but I think it's also a reaction against the idea of plain speech or plain style, which is itself a construction, right? Whether we think of it through Barth's like writing Degree Zero, or we think about the limitations of kind of the development of 60s, 70s, 80s poetry, which really affected how translations happened and really kind of helped us lose a lot of richness of other languages because everything in that time that was being published by the major publishers was being translated into this U.S. plain style, which has its charms, but where a lot of the formal difficulties, sound, a lot of things, even meaning and political meaning was kind of erased in. Or kind of essentialized in some way, whether it's Lorca being translated by Bly or Mandelstam being translated by Merwin, you get kind of a flattening, or a kind of, oh, well, Lorca, he's just like a hot Spaniard, he's Latin, and he's deep. And you miss all of the intellect in Lorca because it was so essentializing. And so, there's a whole book about that. If you're interested, I'll tell you about it. It's pretty fascinating, but so I'm interested in like troubling that plainness and also the kind of the I here. There's an I. There's a U. It's a very lyric structure. There's a either elegy or this kind of love poem to a lost lover often, or complaint to a lover. But the I and the U are very constructed here. I mean, I can't claim they're not specifically me and somebody else. They're like kind of, they're made, they're constructed. And so I think about like using my tools, my materials, which are, translation and thinking about translation, to be reading, other writers. My material is like many other writers and voices and traditions. And so like, I'm like, I try to shape something out of that material and make this I and this you and out of literary tropes to some degree, and also just like maybe clashing traditions or clashing registers or lexicons or languages. Yeah. So, I mean, it's a broad question. I hope we didn't spend too much time.
Yeah, thank you. Thank
you.
Matvei.
Yes.
Speaking of sort of other writer adjacency and other Englishes, I was wondering if the passage, "This is my house," and then the successive clauses that came after it, was somehow an echo of towards the end of that Alan Dukan poem to his wife. No.
Who is that? Sorry, I don't know that much.
No. He was part of that cabal, the sort of mid-century sort of plain speak.
Oh
cabal.
Yeah,
Alan Dukan.
Dukan. Oh yeah, I do.
Yeah.
I've heard of Alan Dukan. Yes.
Yeah.
I've probably read a little bit, but I maybe don't know that poem.
Okay.
It may have been. Also it's interesting because we go through these generations. Like, I don't like the books that are, or the poems that are assigned to some of you guys were not assigned to me, and the poems I was assigned were not assigned to the generation before me. So it's like, it's really the evolving canon also means that we are all speaking very different languages about, which is complicated. I don't know if it's bad or good. It just means that it is hard to find common ground. We don't really know which is maybe good. We don't know what our literary tradition is. There's been a real attempt through plain style, or, for a lot of American poetry, there's an attempt to find a national voice, right? And to identify as American, right, which is complicated, and it often has to do with ideas stemming out of Whitman and Manifest Destiny and all kinds of things, but to create that voice that is specifically American. And Williams and some of the avant-gardists also have troubling relationships to this desire for national identity and a national poetry. And that is one thing that I'm very much in these poems aware of and interested in troubling, because I think that is, and it's also why it's interesting to me to try on Americanisms, because in my mouth, I have a poem in that book that I didn't read, which is like, Maybe I'll just read those few lines. It's a longer poem that starts with kind of an image of Frank O'Hara's New York, and my distance from it in terms of the rise of inflation, actually. But anyway, it goes, roll it, not fold it. Next up, the cantos, Maximus, and all that. As a poet, I'm fortunate to know in the audience tonight says, "Fuck everybody." It's more IRL in native mouth, which is being a poet. Rogers and Hart, they say, not Hart and Rogers. Who says? Right, like, who knows which the order is, Hart and Rogers or Rogers and Hart? Those in a specific, American English would have one per order, right, for that. But it's sort of arbitrary, but it sounds right. And just like it sounds authentic, or it's connected to a tradition, right? Which is a beautiful thing. I'm glad. I will tell somebody who's learning English, no, that's not how you say it in English, like, because it just doesn't sound like the right order. Not that it's grammatically wrong. Yeah. If I may finish, so just to answer the question, the thing about home, it's my home. I mean, I was kind of imagining I'm Bernadette Mayer, but I'm also not. It's my home. I'm also maybe like her partner, Louis Warsh, who was a friend of mine and who was there with her. I don't know. It's just like, I think I stole that. I don't know where I stole that line about feeding. I think it's an episode that I think I remember, but actually someone told me I made up, that Louis Warsh and Bernadette Mayer have this collective memoir that came out recently about their time in Western Massachusetts in that house where she wrote Midwinter Day, this great book, which I'm sort of referring to sort of like in a funny way, but that there's some episode of a cake being a lover eating you feed some of the cake to one lover and then you feed some of the cake to another lover, like the next day. And then you're like, yeah, I baked this cake. Hey, like, but I don't actually think that, I think actually it must come out of my own life, sadly. So, but yeah, thank you. I'm glad there was an echo. I hope there are echoes. Sorry, go ahead. There was a question over here.
I wonder if you could talk about what it is.
I think they need the mic for posterity.
I wonder if you could talk about what it is that you like so much about Arkady Dragomashenko.
Mm-hmm.
Just.
It's Rogers and Hart. No, I'm just kidding. Arkady Dragomashenko. Yeah. Thank you for asking. Did you know him? I know he came through here, I think.
No, I never met him when he was alive.
Arkady is a very interesting topic, which I'll try not to go. Maybe I'll just say a few words. Arkady Dragomashenko, who had taught in the U.S. a few times at Buffalo and came to NYU. But really was a Petersburg, well, I say Petersburg, but Leningrad poet, but a poet in the Petersburg tradition in some ways. But he was born I think he was born in Germany. Was it already in Ukraine? Because I think he was like, he grew up in Ukraine, but I think he was actually born in maybe Poland as the Soviet army was retreating, coming back after having conquered Berlin. His dad was a military guy, and so he was born sort of right at the tail end of the war, and then grew up in Ukraine and then moved to Petersburg. And there, Arkady became one of the central figures in a scene of poets who are writing, partly connected to this thing called the metaphorical, or what else do they meta-realist. Sometimes they would say metaphorical, but meta-realist school of Alexei Parshikov and others, Zhdanov, some great poets. Anyway, but also was sort of this underground Leningrad poetry scene that was heavily influenced by Western postmodern and deconstructive theory. at a time when not many people were reading that kind of thing in the Soviet Union, was very deeply influenced in the 80s by communications with U.S. poets, particularly of the language school, Lynn Heginian, who else went there? Bob maybe went there, Bob Perlman from here, who taught here. I think he did go at some point. Yeah.
But what do you like?
Oh, what do I like? Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, well, not everybody knows who he is. Yeah. Why do I like?
Any writer that you don't know, I want to tell you about this guy.
Yeah, he's an interesting figure he's important to a lot of my friends of my generation because he was kind of a mentor to a lot of younger poets in the late 80s. And he was very instrumental in making poetry events happen. So he was also part of the material culture of Russian language poetry. Soviet poetry was a very important figure in the underground. But what I like about his poetry is that it moves against a kind of it's decentered, like it's a voice that kind of moves very fluidly between all kinds of levels of discourse, from kitchen table talk to philosophy to Buddhism to kind of like, it's also this kind of, it's full of like reflections and mirrors and transparencies and kind of refractions of the, like he'll look at this thing and he'll just talk about something on the kitchen table and then he'll look through it into some window of the next building and then a whole thing about philosophy will arise from it, and it just moves around. But it sounds, the reason I like it is that it sounds like you're just talking to someone who's a little tipsy and just going on and blah, 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 and yet it has real rhythmic structure. So it's like the lines and jam and move and flow, and there's like some kind of speech that he captures that's really beautiful, that's both contemporary and very broad and like bringing in all kinds of terminology, but also stays with the kind of conversational space. So it's very conversational, but doesn't suggest that conversation is just plain language. It's like, could be astral and spiritual and philosophical and scientific and yeah. Okay, is that okay? That's why I like it. Why do you like it? Maybe you don't. But maybe we'll let other people ask some questions, and if there's time, I'll read a poem or two.
I have the mic, so I'm gonna
Okay,
use
all
it.
right. This is one of my students.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for coming and being here. I'm going to turn the focus back to you, if that's okay. I was curious about your fixation with winter to begin with, and hearing a lot about loss in the poems. I'm curious about which came first, the fixation with winter or the loss. And side note, I'm interested if the translation stuff is like just incidental to the talking about winter, or if that is just, or if that's like particularly connected to the idea of winter for you in some way.
If talking about
The translation and the idiomatic playing.
Yeah, I mean the winter theme. I mean, I was coming out of having written. It took me a long time to write this one very short book of poems, 50 poems or so. It's like getting it down, and that book was very kind of objectivist, if you would put it in an American space. I don't know. It was just very much observational and very much about a you, like a you that's moving through worlds and landscapes. That's like the poem that I read at the beginning was part of that. You're standing there with a beer, right? But there's, I don't know, it's like looking at different micro worlds. And then I came out of that book thinking, I just like try something else, something new. And I experienced kind of like, a broken-hearted situation, as many of us do in life. And so I was like, you know what, this winter I'm just going to write the hell out of this brokenheartedness in a notebook and see what happens. And that's just going to be one little chapbook or project for the winter, just to like go all into the things we're not supposed to dwell on: melancholy, self-pity, sadness, loss, it was like into depression, straight in. Just put it all on the page and then see what I can make of that. And like there was some kind of interesting tone coming out, and then I was thinking about complaining and the masculine kind of lyric poetry, male voice, and thinking about like what is that through history and like how has that changed. And I was reading Ovid, writing from the Black Sea in exile, Roman poet. He's exiled, he's in the back of beyond, and he's like, it's winter and it's freezing and there's like warring tribes and all of this, like he's used to being in the urban capital and now he's like on the outskirts, and thinking about his complaint. He's like writing letter after letter about, could you at least make sure that my bones get home? Now he's already like, I know you tried to like, I wish you would try to talk to so-and-so. Like these are poems where he's like telling his wife or friends to like, well, if you remember me, if only you'd remember, maybe you remember me from time to time. I'm that guy that's stuck in the asshole of the empire. And, and it's just this incredible complaint. And I was like, wow, this was okay, and this is beautiful and like kind of weird. And so I was like, well, how does complaint work now? What is it like to whine in a poem, and why not dwell in these spaces that we're sort of told to take medication for and so forth? So get over it, and like pull up your bootstraps, all this kind of things that talk about like success, and like you can't let heartbreak get you down. There's more fish in the sea, blah blah blah. But so why not stay in that space? And then I started seeing that winter, like I had started with including winter in the lines, and I started getting interested in what else does winter mean, like the stasis, and also feeling like, okay, I'm ready at almost 50 to write something about getting old. I'm not young anymore, and and things are narrowing. I kind of know who I am or what I've been doing. So I'm just going to write into obsolescence, and like, especially in a culture that is very, youth focused, what's a new book? What's the first book by new poet? Who cares about older poetry? It's all about the contemporary. So, make it new, said Pound. But I'm kind of like, well, what is the obsolete thing? How can I dwell in that also? Like not only melancholy or whining about lost love, but also dwell in obsolescence, outmodedness, the feelings of like technological speed and getting behind, and becoming like a product that is no longer under warranty. So yeah, those kinds of things started to emerge, and through that, I think that's where like, I want to bring in these other, like this kind of translations of, especially looking at classical Chinese poetry, where there's a lot of melancholy moments of like waiting for someone like to return, or parting ways with a friend that you might not see forever, and all of these wonderful old tropes, right? And seasonal changes are often part of older poetries, right? So anyway, so that's where sort of other languages, and trying to like also make English sound a little bit, my English sound a little like oddly old-fashioned in places with the diction, or kind of unneeded, like leftover. So that's sort of where the winter thing started to coalesce, and then I spent like 8 years writing them, and we'll see where it goes. I'm still working on it. Yeah.
I was really glad for that last question, and I just like the piece of the question which I wanted to add was about constraint. If you could talk about the decision to write.
Right. So the first winter, I didn't have a syllabic
Dufu,
constraint.
to talk about Dufu. Is there like
talk about Dufu? Well,
is there Dufu in here?
Yeah.
Do the constraint first.
Yeah, the constraint, and I think that's good also for.
Yeah. So along the lines. Sorry, what was your name? Layla. Layla's question really brings out this pattern. Like, this is in terms of process, right? If process is of interest, I don't know if it really is in the end, but it's there in the poems, right? So the process was, for me, thinking for the first year or so, writing these things with winter, and then realizing like there's something else. Something started to happen if I pushed against the breadth of the line, against my own intuitive place of breaking the line or meaning. That if I used syllabic constructions, like I started to know, I think what happened was I started to notice that the one poem was, oh wait, all these lines are the same, sort of close in syllable count, even though metrically they're different. And then I was like, well, the most obsolete thing in poetry these days is rhyme and meter, and so I was already playing with, oh, no, I don't have therapy today. I canceled in advance.
This is therapy for you.
Yeah, this is replacing. Yeah, it'll be an interesting way to do therapy where you have to like talk about your problems with a really big group of people. Now I'm just talking about my problems. Okay, so it's something I started. It's something I did in a previous book where long poem that I used just the graph paper and I mapped out that some kind of constraint there for 14-line poems in couplets that were all connected, but they all had some of the couplets had to match in terms of how many squares on the graph paper. So like, character count, including spaces. So like what happens when a line has the same character count as another line, but they sound totally different, or they have totally different meters or rhythms. And I'm interested in that sameness and difference happening. So like, or like kind of foregrounding that, both equivalence, which is something people say about, is impossible in translation, but people want it in translation. But and so all the time there's equivalence, but a suggestion of different meters. And also I wanted this phantom of meter to appear for the ear without like being strict about that, so that it would feel somewhat old-fashioned in terms of, oh, there's some kind of meter here, but just to be a phantom of some older and more formal styles without making it about like I'm not trying to write a perfect sonnet or something. Like I am interested in modernism, and it's one of the things. So they're pulling on all of those things, and so the meter became important, or the syllabic count became important because it was a way of saying these poems aren't just free verse. There's something else. And syllabic counting is not an English language tradition. It's more like French, Polish. Like that was also important to me right away. It was like, I'm going to do syllabics in English where it's very uncommon. It's not iambic like meter, right? It's like 10 syllables, 10 syllables, 10 syllables, 10 syllables, 10 syllables, etc. So that created this other foreign thing to push into the English language for me. It's an experiment, I got interested in that.
Yeah, how I interpreted that in your work is that like it's a shift away from tone, which is kind of an American mode, I think, in poetry. I mean, when you think of Alan Dugan is all about tone. I mean, Alan Dugan is actually an interesting poet, is getting forgotten, but it's the trick of the poem is the tone of the poem. And this is
Which
not
can be
what
beautiful,
yeah,
amazing, yeah.
But
If done
that's
right.
kind of something different. It's like, how do you create a poem out of all these other aspects of the poem and put less emphasis on tone? I think, yeah.
Although I think there's this melancholy, there's this droning, but you probably saw there's like some of them are funny or kind of sardonic or about some contemporary banality like the co-working space or, you know, the things that you walk by, and alienation, modern alienation, you know, Baudelaire, blah, 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 you know, you just, you're there, we're there, we're still there, we're in modernity. And that alienation has to do not just with class but colonial histories and huge geopolitical issues, right? That create that alienated feeling. Anyway, that's tangent.
No, that's any other question? Maybe one final question, or did we exhaust you? Did we?
No, I was just.
Yeah.
If you want it, I read one or two more.
I think I would like us maybe to read some of your winter poems, but outside of what has been published.
Okay.
Things that are in the making.
Yeah.
And maybe we should end with that.
Yeah, and if there's another. Okay. These are some things from not in the book. Winter, they stood waiting at the wall, the women in a line, without address, holding parcels that might never meet those now or soon to be no longer alive. Thank God that history is over, and tears shed are now a memory that's falling from the pebble fist of concrete memorial at first thaw. Now I think if I have toner enough to print it the day of the reading or send it to my phone. That's a very sardonic poem about some very dark history. But, you know, here I am. What do I do about that history? This is a strange one, perhaps. Winter is the rest of life I can't get started in poems. Fire's hunger sucking the air out of crushed plains where I breathe haltingly for pity that I not be forgotten as one that once was a conduit, a stage, a banner in the wind, a song for nations to spread wide on lips, commonplace flower blossoming in darkness. The planets, what to do with their expanse, centuries turning. They groan upon their axis as my nose hair grows, my shoulders all blade, churning in their discus toss their remotely personal pain. Just this theater, from here to the end of barkeep's reach. Eggs and milk on automatic belt toward final reckoning. Proof of my purchase, consumer satisfactions guaranteed. After which they no longer belong to the market. To face you with their other faces, so the turnstiles and planets turn in exchange to face you with their other faces, moons. Yet, with the Pleiades gone to their lovers, I keep vigil as Byron watched Lucretia's lock to endure my summers, rank odors of springtime, to find no fixed truths even in signs I stand with, in hangnails. I turn on the lamp to move dark out, and seeing your hand, I wept like William's weeping, necrophiliac at the little pharaoh's glove. I don't know where I got this anecdote about Williams responding to this mummy. I don't know. I forget where I got this, but thinking about the little pharaoh's glove is like, you know, a mummy being suddenly like some big exhibit at the Met, you know, and the poet being driven to tears. I don't know where I got that idea, but it might have happened. Okay. Two more or one more? What do you think? Too
Maybe
short.
one
more.
One more.
Okay, then I'll read this new one that hasn't been published. That's not necessarily a winter poem, although I don't know. But it maybe relates to translation in a way. For now, titled "No Home" poem. To say my eyes are failing, say my sight is failing. To say I have no home, say I'm far from home. Say it's a long way to go. Say there's nowhere to go. Say, they say, go back where you came from. Say, they say, you don't have to go home, but you can't. Say, they say, go where your eyes take you. Go on, they say, get. To say, I have no home, say, my eyes are failing. To say, war without end, say, may peace come soon. They say, it's not my war. They say, whose side are you on? They say, make peace with it. Peace talks, they say, are on the table. To say, can't you hear me? Say, speak English? To say, what language do you speak? Say, do you come from beyond the hill? To say, who's coming to dinner? Say, who's going to clean up this mess? Pushkin? To say, anybody home? Say, whose home is this? To say, nobody's home. Say, winter is coming. How do you spell winter? Over there, they spell winter with a Z.
Thank you. Thank you, Matvei.
Thanks.
Yankelevich.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. Real pleasure.
By the way, there is copies of Dead Winter. So if you want to purchase one, then they're available. And I think, it has to boil down to this transaction at the end, right? This is a capitalist.
Yeah. If you bring it, if you buy it, it's no longer part of the market. It's just
Yes,
yours.
but if you buy it, it's no longer part of the market, and Matvei will be happy to inscribe it for you.
Yeah, I will. At no extra fee. No, but it will support not me if you buy the book, but the small press that published it, Fonograf Editions out in Portland. So, yeah.
All right.
Thanks very much
Once again,
for being here.
Another hand for Matvei Yankelevich. Thank you.